I assume that, as always, Moscow traffic might delay the appearance of a couple of our experts here, but I suggest we should start because we have quite a compressed agenda for today and tomorrow. There are many issues to discuss, and I hope that we will try to stick to our schedule. First of all, on behalf of the Russian International Affairs Council, let me warmly greet everybody here. Of course, we are very happy to have an opportunity to see our Indian guests again. I'm also very glad to see some of the top Russian experts on India and our esteemed former diplomats, representatives from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I do believe that this diverse and rich composition of the participants will generate thought-provoking and intellectually gratifying debates. When I was working on my introductory comments, I went through our files and I discovered that our first meeting, the meeting between the Russian International Affairs Council and the Indian Council on World Affairs took place 6.5 years ago. It was in May of 2013. So we have a considerable length of our interaction. And I keep asking myself, if we look back into May 2013 and think about what we accomplished in the bilateral domain, but also Russia and India as two great powers trying to assist building a new world order, restore the global governance. Can we be satisfied with the outcomes? And I'm afraid that the answer is probably no, rather than yes. Though, of course, we have a lot of success stories. I'm sure that the ambassador and also the foreign ministry can give us a lot of examples of very important developments in the bilateral relationship or of the Russian-Indian coordination in global affairs. But still, I don't think that we can be fully satisfied with what we accomplished over the last 6.5 years. I think that we definitely have a lot of untapped potential in the bilateral relationship, but also a lot of opportunities to work together on major regional and global matters. Unfortunately, the world is not getting safer, it's not getting more stable, it's not getting more predictable. Our two countries confront very serious challenges, which I hope will be discussed at this table during this conference. But let us think about what we can do, how we can contribute to this relationship and to Russia and India working together. Definitely, it's not our intention, it shouldn't be our intention to duplicate the first track of the relationship. We have many channels of communication, we have intergovernmental commissions, we have business interactions, we have a lot of things which go on in the military technical cooperation between our two countries. I don't think that we can bring a lot of value added in these areas. However, one of the privileges of think tanks, of independent research and analytical centers, our ability to look beyond the horizon, to try to get into out-of-the-box thinking. And that was our intention when we planned this conference. As you can see, it covers pretty everything in the relationship, both on the bilateral level and the level of global involvement of Russia and India. But what I suggest doing, I think that, again, it might be trivial, but I think that we should look for non-orthodox ways to promote this cooperation. If you take bilateral relations, for example, a lot has been said about cooperation in the defense sector, but not much has been discussed in how India and Russia confront the challenge of Industry 4.0. Whether we can cooperate in this area, whether we can be partners or competitors, how the world is going to change, what opportunities and limitations we might face in this new technological environment. Likewise, when we talk about regional and global dimensions, I think that even if you take next year, there are many things where we can make a contribution. Next year, Russia will host the BRICS summit and the SCO summit, and definitely we can work together on the agendas of these two important events. Next year will be the year of next NPT review conference, and as we all know, there are many problems regarding the preparation of the conference. We can talk about the Middle East, and I think that next year will be another difficult year for the MENA region. We can talk about whether India and Russia can work together in other parts of the world. For example, just a month ago, we had an important Russian-African summit, and I see no reason why Russia and India cannot work jointly in the African continent. So there are many areas where I think our two organizations can make a contribution and can assist our respective governments in enhancing the Russian-Indian cooperation and also increasing the role of Russia and India in restoring the global governance. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but my feeling is that we're approaching a tipping point in the international system, and if we do nothing, then we might face a lot of volatility and maybe a systemic crisis, which will definitely affect both Russia and India. Let me stop here and pass the floor to the Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs, Ambassador Angava.
Thank you very much, Director General Kortunov. Thank you. I thank the Russian International Affairs Council, all your colleagues, for hosting this third of our series of dialogues. Ambassador Krubnikov, great honor to be on the panel with you. Ambassador Venkatesh Verma, thank you very much for your presence here today. Dear colleagues, well, to begin with the point which you concluded on, that are we approaching a tipping point in the international system as we know it, and really this year and the next year from an Indian perspective provide a very good platform for discussing it. In 1919, while India was still a colony, we became a full-fledged member of the League of Nations. And this was called then, and it was an anachronism, that a country which was not sovereign had become an international entity in its own right. So this year, and the first meeting of the League was in 1920, really is a centenary of Indian multilateralism in many ways. And next year is also going to be the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. So both of these coming together really does provide an opportunity for thinking about global governance in a broad historical perspective, but looking forward, not just looking back. And I take your point, Director General. I think it's something which India and Russia can, as long partners in the international system and which have vital stakes in a system of international law to which we have both contributed. I think that's very important that we work together. We are planning in the Indian Council of World Affairs a conference on this very theme, centering around the century of Indian multilateralism. And we'll be very glad to work with you. I'm very happy that what we agreed to last year when we met in Delhi, that it will be good if researchers on both our sides work together in producing some kind of document which takes stock of where we are. And I think both from your side and from our side, a paper has been uploaded on our respective websites looking at the political and strategic situation, and the other on the economic and commercial situation. I think we need to do more of such joint activities in terms of putting researchers together and asking them to play with ideas, looking beyond the horizon, as you said, because that is really the value which a think tank interaction can bring to the table. And I think for a track 2 or a track 1.5 dialogue, nothing can be more valuable than that. We have, as you said, a very heavy agenda in front of us, and we'll have chance to contribute to each of the points. I thought I'll mention 1 or 2 points in particular which strike me and being relevant to our discussions on changes in the world order. And from an Indian perspective, there are 3 points which come to view immediately. And the first is, which I thought it's worth flagging, is the emergent new dimension in Indian foreign policy thinking, which increasingly thinks of or focuses on maritime issues. I think the maritime perspective on Indian foreign policy is a new dimension, and it's a development of the past decade. Of course, certain concepts grab the attention, and one of them is the Indo-Pacific. But really, this concept is important in explaining the shift in thinking which is taking place, which is from a largely maritime, which is from a largely continental, to one in which the continental and the maritime have equal importance. Recently, our Prime Minister was in the Far East for the Eurasian Summit and for the annual summit, and then there was talk about the Vladivostok-Chennai Connect, and this really also sums up where Russian and Indian positions can benefit a great deal from each other's exchange of views on maritime issues. I think in India, when we look at our maritime world, one immediate contrast comes to mind, which is between the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Western Indian Ocean, or in particular between the Bay of Bengal littoral and the Arabian Sea littoral. In the Bay of Bengal littoral, we find there are any number of interlocking intergovernmental arrangements which act to moderate conflicts. So you have the Bay of Bengal, BIMSTEC, you have ASEAN, you have ASEAN plus 6, you have the East Asia Summit process, and but there are a number of, as I said, interlocking intergovernmental regional economic arrangements. On the other hand, when we look at the Western Indian Ocean, and in particular the Arabian Sea littoral, you find that there is no such, there is in fact a total absence of intergovernmental thinking in terms of interlocking arrangements. So you have any number of bilateral issues. And I think this contrast between the Eastern and the Western Indian Ocean is central to the maritime perspective as it is emergent in India. I think there are many countries which are of the view that the Indo-Pacific represents an American concept. Yes, it is an American concept, it's a Japanese concept, it's an ASEAN concept, it's an Indonesian concept, but it's also an Indian concept. And the Indian concept has always paid equal attention to the Arabian Sea littoral and the Western Indian Ocean as much as it has to the Bay of Bengal and the South and further between the Indian and the Pacific, the South China Sea, etc., etc. And the main reason is that our interests in the Arabian Sea littoral are as vital as they are on our east. We have almost 10 million Indians working in the Gulf states. We have vital investment and hydrocarbon relationships. So when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, I think this wide maritime space all the way to the eastern coast of Africa is something central to our thinking, and focusing too much on Quad or on the South China Sea or on the centrality of ASEAN actually takes away from this wider perspective which we have. And I think this is something which we can discuss with each other because Russia has its own experience of the maritime world is something which we will benefit from a great deal from interfacing with. The second point I wish to talk about was really in our own region, and again this meeting in many ways the issues we confront today in South Asia, Southwest Asia can be traced back to forces which were unleashed in 1979 and 1989. 1979 Iranian Revolution, Islamic radicalism in Saudi Arabia, execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, any number of factors came up in that year. 1989, similarly, you have the coming down of the Berlin Wall and major developments in Europe, of course, but also the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that, as a consequence, breeds a kind of triumphalism in the Pakistan military. That the template which has been developed in Afghanistan to confront a superpower can now be applied in South Asia against India. And it's no coincidence that the insurgency in Kashmir begins in that year. So I think in many ways the situation we confront in our region has roots which go back to these two very important years. And I think it's important that we have a continuous exchange of views on Iran, on Afghanistan, on Pakistan, because that is very useful for both for us as a think tank and as an analytical institution, but also in terms of understanding each other's policy perspectives. And in Pakistan today we see a situation of multiple crises, but primarily falling around three structural axes. And the first axis is its crisis in its internal polity. And one example of that is that you have one president in exile, another former president in jail, three former prime ministers in jail. One is about to leave the country to go abroad on medical treatment. But there is a crisis in its internal polity, and it's a crisis of the longue durée. It's a long-term structural crisis. The second is the whole issue around the relationship between the civilian and the military institutions. Again, not a new factor in Pakistan, but when this factor becomes a major, reaches a major turning point, is very difficult to predict. But it happens periodically, every 3 or 4 years. And the third is, of course, the regional situation, which is Pakistan's anxieties about Afghanistan and its anxieties pertaining to India. So our predicaments in our neighborhood pertain, of course, to this, to the Pakistan factor, but there are also larger issues, and one of them is, of course, most importantly, the role of China and the China factor in international affairs. This is something which every foreign office, every think tank deals with and discusses. For India, the China factor is very important because we are no longer dealing with a great power which is some distance removed. It's not like the old days of non-alignment where we can balance the Soviet Union and the United States and take a midway path or have very strong relations with the Soviet Union. Now we have a great power proximate to us. It is in our neighborhood, and that affects every one of our relationships. So it requires new ways of thinking, and one is, of course, consolidating our own relationship with China. And in there the informal summit process has played a very useful role between the leadership of both countries. And we recently had the president of China and India for the second informal summit in Mahabalipuram. Very useful meeting. But beyond the bilateral, there are other ways of we interface with China, and one is through platforms in which there are other countries. So SCO is one example. Russia, India, China grouping is yet another example. And there are, of course, there's BRICS and there's G20 and so on and so forth. So how we deal with China, therefore, is a major challenge for us. And there is a perspective which I think is mistaken, which sees our interface with China in terms of an older vision of containment. The term containment does not articulate India's perspective at all, because containment was conceptualized in the 1950s and 1960s in the Cold War, and that situation, that environment was totally different from the situation we deal with today. The Soviet Union and the United States did not have the kind of strong economic relationships and the integrated relationships of the kind which China has with the United States today, or China has with Russia today, or indeed the way China has with India today. So containment is really not the perspective through which India sees China, but really it is how you consolidate our bilateral relationships and engage with China multilaterally through these different forums, and of course also be part of other forums such as Japan, United States, India, or Quad, and so on and so forth. The third point, very briefly, I wish to mention pertains to the economic domain, and we have one of our colleagues who will talk about it at greater length, which is we recently took the difficult decision of staying out of the RCEP, a regional configuration consisting of Asian countries meant to be a free trade agreement. But we decided to stay out because many of our vital concerns concerning our access for Indian products and rules of origin and non-tariff barriers which our exports faced. But the issue, the general issue which is relevant is that the way we see the world today, it is very clear that the old WTO system based on MFN is now changing into something different. And that different situation or different creature which is arising is of very strong regional trading blocks all across the world. And a vast bulk of international trade now takes place because of these regional trading FTAs which have emerged. The issue for us is that if you look at the broad breakup of India's trade, it has 5 or 4 major destinations, about 100 billion to Southeast Asia, 100 billion to the Gulf, 100 billion or so to Europe, and 100 billion to the United States. So roughly 4 broad areas. But we don't have FTAs except with Southeast Asia. So a large part of our trade is falling outside the scope of any of these major regional trading arrangements. And if we plan to grow our exports exponentially, which is essential given our own ambitions to upscale our economy to the level of $5 trillion, that means we have to do much more thinking about this. And this brings us again to a point where Russia and India can converge and discuss a great deal about this. We are having, I think we are going to begin our own discussions on the Eurasian free trade area very soon. But certainly at the think tank level, to talk about the future of international trading systems and the role which India and Russia can play, not as predominant powers in that trading system, but as major stakeholders in it, would be very useful. I'll stop with these remarks. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more. And again, let me thank you very much for hosting the third dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ravan. Let me, as a kind of lyrical digression, share with you a recent story that I had in Beijing. I gave a lecture at the Beijing State University, a large audience of students and graduate students. And the topic of my lecture was the future of Asia. And I made a point that the future of Asia depends on one country, which is India. And that created an uproar in the audience. Why India? Why not China? We're much bigger. We are, much stronger than India. And my response to these comments was that the trajectory of the Chinese policy is clear. We know what we want to accomplish. We know how you want to accomplish. We know the Brick and Road Initiative and other initiatives of China. But India, to some extent, remains the biggest single swing state, not just in Asia, but arguably in the world. A lot of independent variables concerning India. Because India is a democracy, which China is not. So there is less predictability about the future of India, including the Indian foreign policy. And my question to my Chinese counterparts was, if you are so concerned about India, and they are concerned, of course, how can you explain that China takes a strategic approach to Russia, but a situational approach towards India? Why, China cannot demonstrate slightly more strategic vision dealing with Delhi? And of course they started saying, well, you cannot really compare Russia and India. It's two very different things. It's so difficult to work with Indians. The Chinese rhetoric. But my take is that indeed, when we're thinking about the future of the international system, it is very important to demystify some of the Indian prospects and perceptions, including the Indo-Pacific concept. Because indeed, you are absolutely right. There are very different ways in which this concept is interpreted in India, in Japan, and in the United States. And we should not keep ourselves hostage to the US interpretation of the Pacific. And the US policy might also shift. So I think that these issues are really important. And let me also add, you mentioned the evolution of the current international trade system, but let me remind you that next month we might see a lethal crisis in WTO. If the United States, continues to block nominations to the arbitrary committee, the WTO will be paralyzed. And we have to decide, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to try to maintain the global system, or indeed the future is in the regional trading blocks? But then we should face the repercussions of this fragmentation of the global system. And of course, you are, again, absolutely right. We are in the same boat here, because you have very limited free trade agreements. We have very limited free trade agreements as well. So we will be to suffer more than some other countries. Look at what Europeans are doing with their trade. It's something that we can definitely learn, and probably something that we can discuss later today. And now it is my honor to give the floor to the person who is probably the most distinguished expert on India and on many other areas of international relations, a person who had very vast experience working in India and around India. And we are privileged to have Ambassador and General Trubnikov as Vice President of the Russian International Council. Thank you for staying with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for so pompous introduction of myself. But nevertheless, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to welcome here my Indian colleagues, no doubt. I am proud to be present here and to take part into introductory discussion. As my friend Kortunov, I also try to have a glance retrospectively on our relations between our two organizations. But I did not go so deep as Mr. Kortunov. I went back to 2 years' time, to our first conference devoted to the 70th anniversary of establishment of our diplomatic relations. For that reason, I went back through the pages of the report which was presented at that conference, and specifically through my preface, trying to analyze what has been achieved by now from the suggestions which were given by experts and by myself as well. You know, I can't say that I have been completely dissatisfied. No. I think that from the point of view of moving ahead, we reached something, at least organizationally. During this period of time, 2 years' time, we now have Indian-Russian economic strategic dialogue. I was present in the last spring in New-Deli, and I am very much happy that the discussions which took place in commissions, in groups, they were rather practical. This is a very, very important thing. From the point of view of new features of our relationship, or features which obtained more importance than before, I might name cooperation between regions of our two countries. And this is, I feel, due to the efforts by your Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, who was actively maintained close relations when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat with Astrakhan region of ours. So he knows it practically to what aim, to what goals such kind of cooperation might reach. This is a very important thing, and during the Vladivostok Economic Forum just recently, this idea of expansion of relations between Indian states and regions of Russian Federation was very much practical. And what is that the basis of such kind of cooperation was purely economic. There was no question about military technical cooperation or cooperation in nuclear sphere and so on and so forth. It was rather practical, and the very fact that on the eve of Vladivostok Forum, there was a big delegation from India, including 5 chief ministers of Indian states and representatives from 140 Indian firms. This is a very important feature. So we might consider this as a first and important strategic step in the development of our relations. Then, what else we reached meanwhile? I can't say that the international situation became better. Quite otherwise, it has become worse, less predictable, and you know that we have to understand that now the international situation, and specifically what is nearer to us, the situation in Eurasian region, it is becoming very flexible. We now have different approaches and understanding on how the Eurasian security might be guaranteed. China, for example, looks at its suggestion on One Belt, One Road as the most important and stable economic factor which might be basis for building up the new architecture of security in Eurasia. Definitely, China thinks and looks upon its own idea through its own glasses. Russia considers that economic ties might be the most important factor which might guarantee stable structure for peaceful development in Eurasia, while developing the idea and the structure of Eurasian Economic Union. What is happening that India now thinks in terms of joining efforts with this union in the sphere of free trade zone. The negotiations did not start yet, but nevertheless the idea was welcomed by two leaders, which is very important. The third outlook at how the structure for peace in Eurasia might be guaranteed is Quad. This is American idea. And contrary to previous kind of thinking, Quad bases its outlook on military cooperation. Leaving aside economic ties and cultural ties and other ties, military or military political. Because in any case, and I do share this opinion, that major idea is of course containing China. This is something which cannot guarantee stable and durable, peaceful architecture of security in Eurasia. Because the idea of developing military relations or military political relations, I feel, is looked upon skeptically, and Ambassador Raghavan practically proved this, by India. Because from Indian point of view, it is one of the way of securing, or not securing, but guaranteeing security for maritime routes, trade routes, and the routes for delivering goods. By the way, Indo-Pacific idea is absolutely corresponding with the interests of India, which carries oil from Sakhalin to India. So it is not questionable that India is justified in its approach to joining Quad. But nevertheless, we have to look upon new situation, which it seems to me shows already in the recent efforts by leaders of China and India, which was reflected in their informal meetings, that slowly understanding between India and China might make its way. And for this idea, just look, at least it was mentioned in the press reports, that Chinese president, while being in Chennai, mentioned Chennai as a very good transit point for the southern vector of their idea of one belt, one road. But then, why don't we think about involving our idea, Indian and Russian, of international transport corridor northeast to the Chinese idea of one belt, one road? It is absolutely possible. Now it is developing very slowly, this idea. But I looked upon the results of recent BRICS summit. You know, BRICS has in their hands very serious financial resource in terms of new development bank of BRICS. $100 billion. Why not to involve the efforts of 3 countries based on their participation in BRICS, Russia, India, and China, to finance the north-south corridor? The money which now bank spends is directed to very limited and not so much important projects. So we now have this as a positive development. So I feel that the more we try to find positive in today's very negative situation, the more understanding India and Russia will have. And now probably will involve China as well. So we have a lot of things to ponder upon and to suggest to our leaders. And I would like to wish all of us to come out with concrete and practical suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vyacheslav Ivanovich. I think that this is a very important contribution to our discussion, putting it into a broader perspective. Indeed, I think that we should have a closer look on the opportunities that multilateral international institutions like BRICS and CSO can offer us. As I mentioned, next year Russia will host the 2 meetings, and I think it will be important to get into details. They often say that India is not a part of One Belt, One Road initiative, but let me remind you that neither is Russia. Russia is not formally a member or a participant to the One Brick and Road initiative. It coordinates its own integration efforts with this initiative, but in a very special way. Maybe there is something that India can learn from our experience, and maybe we will come to a common denominator. Now let me give the floor to Ambassador Varma, and let me use this opportunity to say that we are very grateful to the Indian Embassy for all the assistance that we received working on this event, but more generally the embassy has always been very receptive to our initiatives, and we hope that we might have been of some assistance to the embassy as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kotunov, Ambassador Trubnikov, Ambassador Raghavan, dear colleagues. We are indeed very happy to be part of this very good event that is now taking place, the third interaction between the Russian International Affairs Council and the ICWA in India. We have here very senior scholars from India, but also the new generation of young scholars also is part of our team. And I see that that is also replicated on the Russian side, and it shows the intergenerational support for these consultations. India and Russia are uniquely placed in this very turbulent world. This has been a particularly productive year in India-Russia relations. Prime Minister Modi met President Putin just last week in Brasilia on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. There was an extraordinarily successful bilateral summit in early September in Vladivostok, where the Prime Minister was also the chief guest at the Eastern Economic Forum. And as Ambassador Trubnikov mentioned, we had a big delegation of our Commerce Minister and four Chief Ministers to Vladivostok, and as a follow-up, our Petroleum Minister also visited Vladivostok. I don't think in the last 30 years India has paid so much attention to Vladivostok in a period of 2 months. But that shows how the inherent strength of the India-Russia relationship allows both India and Russia to respond more easily to changing developments. This point I think needs to be mentioned, because there is, I think, no easy parallel that we can see in the world where there is such good combination of continuity and change. So therefore there is an inherent strength and stability in the relationship, and that allows us to reach out and respond to new developments. And that, of course, both leaders have agreed that interregional cooperation will be one of the main drivers of India-Russia relations, and it will also be seen in a larger regional context. As a follow-up, Prime Minister has invited governors from Russia to visit India, and that will be organized in the first quarter of next year, and that again will sort of take this thing forward. We also have a basically coherent, converging view of how the world is changing. And put it simply, we are moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. India and Russia are essential poles of that multipolar world. So therefore, a multipolar world is not possible without India and Russia. So I think that we deserve a place among the poles in the multipolar world. Cooperation amongst the multi-poles, the various poles in the multipolar world is also important. And in that cooperation, I think the India-Russia cooperation now comes right on top, because finally the world is made of good bilateral relations. It is not just, so I think we again need to stress the, India and Russia now cooperate quite actively across the board. We have an interest in a multipolar world, but we also have an interest in a multipolar Asia. Neither India nor Russia wants a multipolar world with a unipolar Asia, and that is quite obvious. We now cooperate at the United Nations, of course, but at the G20, at the SCO, the BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union is something that we are starting. I think our dialogue on the Indo-Pacific has progressed rather well in the last 1 year. There may not be full convergence, but I think there is greater clarity. I think that is the first step. And when we unpack the Indo-Pacific, when we move away from just the labels to the details, actually my own sense is that there is a very large amount of commonality of interest. Now, discussions like these are important in transforming commonality of interest into specific proposals. It is not that commonality of interest automatically gets translated. I think a certain amount of intellectual work or mental work is required to fine-tune positions, to see where each other's interests are adaptable, so to speak, in the new world. India and Russia also have certain commonalities, which not are of our making, but I think something that we need to take into account as we take forward our own national development. Ambassador Raghavan mentioned our vision for reaching India's growth in such a manner that we become a $5 trillion economy in the next 5-6 years. That is very much in our national priority. We pay great attention to Russia's national projects, more than 10 of them, which are designed to make Russia a modern, effective, economically developed state, to move to the 5th or the 6th level of economy in the world. And actually, these two national projects actually give commonality of interest. In the last decade, the international economic situation was far more conducive to India's national growth as well as Russia's national growth. That has changed in this decade. The international environment has become less positive, less helpful for our own national development programs. And as the speakers before me have mentioned, Ambassador Raghavan mentioned it, the international economic architecture, which we thought we were investing in the early 90s, has actually turned on itself. So we may be latecomers to the international architecture, but just when we were about to take advantage of what it had to offer, that it turned on itself and is closing its doors to India and Russia. So we need to find ways of adapting ourselves. With that said, I think we also need to take into account new technologies, which are both in the civilian sector and the military sector. Just as the international security situation is changing, we need to find new avenues for cooperation. In the defense sector, I think the Make in India program in India is a very important dimension of the future growth of India-Russia defense relations. There are very good prospects of that. Our defense minister was here 2 weeks ago, and we had an international conference on defense industry. And we have, for the first time, which we don't have with any other foreign country, an agreement on a joint manufacture of spares in India. And that is something that we have with Russia. According to that agreement, orders will be placed for at least a minimum of 5 years. So the industry has a predictable order position. They know that these spares will be required in the next 5 to 10 years or 15 years. And as per that agreement, there will be no tender. It will be on a joint venture basis. So this is special facilities that we are bringing forth to take forward the India-Russia relationship. Russia is very much interested in creating a civil aviation industry in India. India has a very well-developed military aviation industry, but unfortunately, because we have depended on foreign suppliers, we don't have a civil aviation industry, and Russia is very much interested, and we are very much interested in taking that forward. As the international architecture changes, I think we need to place more emphasis on using national currencies. International sanctions, wherever they come from, are now, it appears, will be a fact of life for the foreseeable future. They are not a passing dream, a passing nightmare. They will be there. So I think we need to find ways of adapting ourselves through technological means, through banking means, through greater use of innovative means of using national currencies. International issues, I think, are also very important. During the course of the discussions, you will hear from our Indian colleagues recent measures taken by India, by the government, to consolidate India's unity and territorial integrity. Now, it might come as a surprise to some of those who don't follow India on an everyday basis, that why is it that India is doing it 70 years after its independence? But the fact is that we are doing it, and we're doing it in a democratic manner. consistent with our constitution, and I'm sure our Indian colleagues, friends will be able to explain in greater detail what we're doing. The situation in Afghanistan is a common concern. We do not wish that the change in Afghanistan leads to a stage where radical Islamic groups take hold of power in Kabul, irrespective of what you might call them. That pose again a threat to both India and Russia, and that's something that we can cope with. The media I have watched with, I think, very closely, but I think quite with a certain amount of admiration, how Russia has conducted itself in the Middle East. And I think the special consultations between India and Russia on the Middle East are very much on the cards. So in your discussions, if you can put up some new ideas, it's something that we will find. We are happy that Russia has returned to Africa, to the Africa Summit. We can share quite a bit of experience because we too have excellent relations with Africa, with the African Summit. And we too have done the African Summit before, so that is something that we can take forward. Let me end by mentioning one point which no other relationship has. This year, as we celebrate the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the Indian nation, we also celebrated the unique friendship between Mahatma Gandhi and Tolstoy. We had a function in Yasna Polyana, we had another function in the State Duma, and I would like to acknowledge the contribution made by a number of India scholars, especially from the Institute of Oriental Studies, who made that event very special and very unique. So therefore, let me conclude by saying that this is an extraordinarily well endowed group. We can discuss the future of India-Russia relations and its role in the future world order, but also confident that we have a very good history to fall back on, going back to the unique friendship between Gandhi and Tolstoy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Varma, for this very inspirational presentation. Indeed, there are many things that we can be proud of, and these things clearly go beyond specific projects, and they have deep roots in history. And when discussing contemporary issues, we should not forget about the foundation of the relationship, which remains very solid, and I think that it will stay this way in the foreseeable future. Let me also say, in concluding our introductory session, that one of the advantages of this format is that we can discuss here even the most sensitive issues. And the issues which might raise concerns on each of the sides, I think that in the spirit of our cooperation and traditional friendship, we should not shy away from controversial matters. Some of them have already been mentioned here. I think that we will be useful to our respective governments if we focus on issues that are probably more difficult to discuss at the official level. So with this, let me close the introductory session. We're supposed to have a technical break. I don't quite understand what it means, but I assume that we should rearrange the table, and in 5 minutes we will get down to the first session of our conference. Thank you.